The shoe was found first, which was, in the strict accounting of what happened that autumn, a small and almost comic detail to have preceded everything else, though no one who found it was in any position to appreciate the comedy at the time. It was a child's shoe, brown leather, scuffed white at the toe, in the particular way of a shoe that has been kicked repeatedly against a stone step by a boy who has not yet learned, or has learned and declined to practice, the difference between walking and arriving. It sat on the third step of Ashdown Hall's east entrance for the better part of a morning, abandoned there by 7-year-old Peter Ashdown in the process of some errand that had, as his errands generally did, been overtaken by a more interesting errand before the first was finished. A housemaid noticed it before noon and did not move it on the general principle, shared by most of the staff at Ashdown Hall that autumn, that very little in the household was improved by anyone's intervention, and that a shoe on a step was, on the whole, one of the smaller disorders currently in residence. The larger disorder was upstairs, in the long gallery that ran the length of the house's north wing, where Lord Corwin Ashdown had been standing at the window for the better part of an hour with the stillness of a man conducting an inventory of his own life and finding the sum unsatisfactory. He was 41 years of age, tall in the manner that had once been called commanding, and had, in recent years, begun to be described more often as merely tall, with dark hair going gray at the temples in a pattern he had inherited from his father, along with the title, the debts, and a particular capacity for silence that he had never entirely decided was a virtue. The window looked out over the south lawn, where his wife's rose garden, neglected now for the better part of 2 seasons, had begun to revert to something closer to hedgerow than ornament, the canes reaching in undisciplined directions, with the confidence of things that have stopped being told what to do. He had received, the previous evening, a letter from his solicitor in Thornbury, concerning the state of the Ashdown accounts, a letter written in the particular tone solicitors reserve for clients they have advised repeatedly and been repeatedly ignored by. And the letter had said, among a great many other things stated with careful indirection, that the house could not continue to be run as it had been run, that certain economies would need to be made, and that these economies would, as economies in households like Ashdown Hall generally did, fall eventually and specifically upon the people least equipped. To argue against them, he had not yet told his wife. Lady Marianne Ashdown, who had been Marianne Wren before her marriage, and who had, in the 11 years since, discovered that the transition from one name to the other had cost her a good deal more than a signature, was at that same hour in the nursery on the 2nd floor, mending a torn hem with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had once been taught to sew by a mother who believed idle hands were a moral failing and had never entirely unlearned the lesson. She was 34, fair-haired, with a face that people who did not know her well described as pleasant, and people who did know her well described, when pressed, as watchful. The face of a woman who had spent a decade in a house where very little was said directly, and had therefore become expert in the things that were said around the edges of silence. She had 2 children, Peter, 7, currently somewhere in the grounds with a shoe he had abandoned still unaccounted for, and Alice, 5, who was at present asleep in the adjoining room with the particular thoroughness of a child who has spent the morning in determined and exhausting play and has not yet learned that sleep is a thing that can be resisted. Marianne loved them with an intensity she had never spoken aloud to anyone, including on most days herself, because she had learned early in her marriage that intensity of any kind, stated plainly, was a thing her husband regarded with the wary discomfort of a man handed a burning coal he had not asked for and did not know where to set down. She had married Corwin Ashdown at 23 for reasons that had seemed at the time entirely sufficient, a comfortable match, a kind enough man, a family name that had carried weight in the county for 3 generations. She had not married him for love, though she had believed in the particular hopeful arithmetic of young women entering such arrangements, that love might grow in the space provided for it, the way certain plants will grow in poor soil if given enough seasons and enough patience. She had given both. The love had not grown. What had grown instead, slowly, and without her quite marking the moment of its arrival, was a low and permanent loneliness that she had learned to carry the way one learns to carry any weight that cannot be set down in company, invisibly and without complaint. She heard him on the stairs before she heard him at the nursery door, his tread recognizable to her after 11 years in the particular unhurried weight of it. A man who had never in his life needed to hurry toward anything. He stood in the doorway for a moment without entering, which she understood, from long practice in reading the small grammar of his hesitations, to mean that he had come to say something he had not yet decided how to say. "The solicitor has written again," he said. "I assumed as much," she said, not looking up from the hymn. "You have the particular stillness you get when Mr. Hallworth has written." He came into the room and stood near the window at a distance from her that she had, over the years, stopped noticing as a distance and started accepting as simply the geometry of how he occupied a room with her in it. "The accounts require economy," he said. "Hallworth is specific about it. The east wing will need to be closed for the winter. Some of the staff will need to be let go. I have been considering it since yesterday evening." "And what have you considered?" He was quiet for a moment, in the way that she had learned across 11 years to recognize as the prelude to something he had rehearsed and was now delivering with less confidence than the rehearsal had suggested he would need. "I have considered," he said, "that this house has been a weight on me since the day I inherited it, and that a family within it is a weight upon a weight, and that I am tired, Marianne, in a manner I do not know how to explain to you, of carrying both." She set down the needle. She did not, in the first moment, understand fully what he had said, because it had been delivered in the same measured tone he used for discussing tenant rents and roof repairs, and it took her a moment to recognize that beneath the tone was a sentence of a different order entirely. "Say that again," she said, "plainly this time." He looked at her, and something in his face. She would think of this moment often in the months that followed, turning it over the way one turns over a stone to examine its underside. Something in his face was almost like relief, the relief of a man finally permitted to put down a thing he had been holding at an awkward angle for a very long time. "My family," he said, "was always a burden to me. I did not choose it with my whole will. I chose it because it was expected, and I have spent 11 years discovering that expectation is a poor foundation for anything, least of all a household with children in it who deserve, I think, a father with more to give them than obligation. The room was very quiet. Somewhere below, faintly, she could hear Peter's voice in the garden, calling something to one of the dogs, entirely unaware that a sentence had just been spoken above him that would reshape the remaining course of his childhood. "Then carry your shame alone," Mary Ann said. She said it without raising her voice, in the same measured register he had used to deliver his confession, because she had understood, in the space of his speaking and her hearing, that raising her voice would give him something to respond to, an anger he could weather or manage or, worse, forgive her for. And she did not intend to give him anything that could be so easily absorbed. She stood. She smoothed the hem she had been mending, folded it, and set it on the chair with the same precision she brought to every task she had ever undertaken in this house. Because precision, she had found, was one of the few things that remained entirely hers. "I will take the children," she said, "to my aunt's house in Fenmarsh. You will not need to carry us any longer, Corwin. You will find, I expect, that the weight was never as heavy as you believed it to be. Weights of that kind rarely are, once a person stops pretending otherwise." He said her name once in a tone she had not heard from him in years, something closer to alarm than she had thought him capable of producing on short notice. But she had already turned toward the door, and the conversation, as far as she was concerned, had concluded. Fenmarsh was a market town 18 miles to the south, built along a slow brown river, and known chiefly for its wool trade and for the particular stubbornness of its inhabitants, a quality Mary Ann's aunt, Prudence Wren, possessed in a concentration that had, over 71 years, become something close to legendary in the town's 3 principal taverns. Prudence had never married, had run a small but profitable drapery business since the age of 26, and had greeted her niece's unannounced arrival with 2 children, 4 trunks, and no explanation beyond "I have left him," with the unhurried practicality of a woman who had long suspected this day would arrive and had, without ever saying so, kept a room prepared for it. "You will want tea," Prudence said, "and then you will want to tell me only as much as you wish to tell me, and then we will discuss what is to be done, because sitting with a thing rarely improves it in my experience, and I have had a great deal of experience." Mary Ann told her over the tea more than she had intended to, in the plain, factual sentences she had learned to use for describing difficult things, because ornament, she had found, only made difficult things heavier to carry. Prudence listened without interrupting, her pale eyes, the same eyes Mary Ann had inherited and would one day see reflected in Alice's face, fixed on her niece with the attention of a woman assessing a bolt of cloth for flaws before committing to a price. "Well," Prudence said, when the account was finished, "he has done you the peculiar favor of being honest about a dishonesty he had likely been practicing for years. Most men manage the same conclusion without ever saying it aloud, and their wives spend decades wondering if they imagined the coldness. You, at least, have been spared the wondering. I do not feel spared anything at present." "No," Prudence agreed. "You will not for some time. But you are 34, Marianne, not 71, and you have 2 children who will need to see, in the coming years, what a woman looks like when she builds something rather than waits for something to be given to her. I would know. I have been building this shop for 45 years, and I have never once waited for anyone to hand me a single bolt of it. His shop, as it happened, was in need of a second set of capable hands, Prudence's regular assistant having recently married and removed to Kingsbridge. And within a fortnight, Marianne had begun to spend her mornings behind the counter, learning the trade with the same methodical attention she had once given to household accounts she was never permitted to fully manage. She discovered, to her own quiet surprise, that she had a talent for it, an instinct for which cloths would sell, and to whom a memory for customers' preferences that Prudence pronounced after the first month unnervingly good, and a capacity for the arithmetic of margins and orders that had gone entirely unused in 11 years of managing a household whose master had never trusted her with anything larger than the weekly grocery accounts. The children adjusted, as children generally do, with a speed that both comforted and quietly wounded her. Peter took to the river and the town's other. Boys with the frictionless ease of a 7-year-old who has not yet learned to mourn what he has left behind, and Alice, who was young enough that Ashdown Hall would likely become, in time, no more than a half-formed impression of a large, cold house she had once lived in, attached herself to Prudence with an affection that Prudence received with visible surprise, and, beneath the surprise, an unmistakable pleasure she was too proud to name directly. If you have been following Marianne's story and have not yet subscribed to this channel, this would be a fitting moment to do so, quietly, the way she would have done it herself, without asking anyone's permission to take up the space she was owed. Ashdown Hall, in the months that followed, did not become lighter for having shed its supposed burden. Corwin had expected, in the private and unexamined part of himself, where he had permitted the confession to form before he ever spoke it, that the departure of his family would restore to him something of the unencumbered self he half remembered from before his marriage, a man answerable to no one, weighted by nothing but his own choices. What he found instead, in the weeks after Marianne's departure, was a house that had somehow become larger in her absence rather than smaller, its silences no longer the ordinary silences of a household going about its business, but something closer to an accusation that followed him from room to room. He did not go to the nursery. He told himself this was practicality. There was nothing in the nursery that required his attention, but he understood, on the evenings when he found himself standing in the corridor outside its closed door for reasons he could not fully account for, that the practicality was a story he was telling himself in place of a truth he was not yet prepared to examine. The estate, freed of the economies he had cited as partial justification for his confession, did not improve. Hallworth's letters continued more pointed with each month, and Corwin found that the clarity he had expected to accompany the shedding of his obligations had not arrived. If anything, the accounts required more attention now, not less, and he discovered himself administering them with a distracted carelessness that would have been unthinkable to him a year earlier, when a household of 4 had at least given his days the shape of purpose, however resentfully he had worn it. He rode to Fen Marsh in November, telling no one, including himself, precisely why, and stood across the street from Prudence Wren's drapery shop for the better part of 20 minutes before he saw through the shop's front window his son, taller already, or so it seemed to him, though it had been only 10 weeks, laughing at something said by a boy Corwin did not recognize. The two of them engaged in some transaction involving a wooden top that appeared to matter to them a great deal. He saw a moment later Mary Ann herself moving behind the counter with a competence and ease he did not remember her possessing, measuring cloth for a customer with quick, sure movements, speaking with an animation in her face that he realized, with the particular unpleasant clarity of a man recognizing something too late, he had rarely, if ever, seen directed at him. He did not cross the street. He rode back to Ashdown Hall in the fading light, and did not speak of the visit to anyone, though it settled into him with the slow, permanent weight of a stone dropped into still water, its ripples continuing long after the stone itself has vanished from sight. The wren appeared at Fenmarsh in December, a small brown bird that took to nesting in the eaves above the drapery shop's back door, with a persistence Prudence found at first mildly irritating, and then over the following weeks oddly companionable. Mary Ann noticed it particularly. She had, after all, been born to a name the bird shared, a fact her father had once told her, in the plain, unsentimental way he told most things, meant nothing at all beyond the accident of a family surname, though she had never quite believed him. The wren returned each morning to the same corner of the eave, singing with a volume that seemed disproportionate to its size, and Mary Ann began, without deciding to leave crumbs on the sill of the shop's back window before opening for the day. It was Alice who found the feather in January, a single, small, brown feather unremarkable in itself, resting on the window-sill one gray morning as though it had been placed there rather than simply dropped, and Alice, 5 years old and entirely unburdened by the adult habit of assigning meaning cautiously, declared with complete confidence that the wren had left it for her mother as a present, because the wren liked her. Mary Ann had smiled at this, the easy, uncomplicated smile she gave her daughter's more fanciful pronouncements, and had kept the feather regardless, pressing it between the pages of the account ledger she used each evening in the place she had come to think of, without quite naming it as such, as the place where she kept the small evidence of things continuing. She did not yet understand what the feather would come to mean to her, in the way that a person rarely understands the full weight of a small-kept thing until enough time has passed for its weight to reveal itself. What she knew that January was only that the shop's takings had improved steadily since the new year, that Peter had begun attending the grammar school in Fenmarsh, and showed, according to his tutor, an aptitude for figures that Prudence pronounced with satisfaction to be a wren trait finally surfacing in the right generation, and that she herself had begun for the first time in longer than she could easily measure to fall asleep most nights without the particular hollow ache she had carried for 11 years and had, until its absence became noticeable, mistaken for simply the ordinary condition of being married. By spring, the drapery shop under Mary Ann's growing management had expanded its trade with 2 neighboring wool merchants, an arrangement she had negotiated herself over the course of several letters and one direct meeting in Kingsbridge that Prudence had attended only to observe declaring afterward, with the particular dry approval she reserved for things that genuinely impressed her, that her niece had conducted the negotiation the way her father should have taught her to conduct her marriage, and did not. More's the pity for both of us. The shop's ledgers, which Mary Ann now kept in a hand as neat and consistent as the one she had once used for Ashdown Hall's household accounts, showed a margin of profit that exceeded, by the close of the first quarter, anything the shop had produced in the 5 years preceding her arrival. She wrote none of this to Corwin. She had not written to him at all since the letter informing him, with the same plainness she brought to everything, of the arrangements she had made for the children's schooling, and asking, as a matter of practical necessity rather than courtesy, that he continue their modest allowance through his solicitor. He had complied without comment, and the silence between them had settled into something that felt, to Mary Ann, less like a wound than like weather, a condition she had adapted to living inside of, the way one adapts to a persistent gray sky, without expecting it to change, and without any longer arranging her days around the hope that it might. Corwin, in the meantime, had begun, slowly, and without any single dramatic turn that he could later point to as the moment of change, to alter the manner in which he administered Ashdown Hall. He had dismissed, in February, the estate manager whose careless stewardship he had for years permitted through simple inattention, and had taken up for the first time since his father's death the direct management of the tenant farms, walking the boundaries himself, reviewing the leases line by line, correcting errors that had gone uncorrected for a decade because no one, including him, had thought it worth the trouble of correcting them. He could not have said, if asked, precisely why he had begun this, except that the stillness of the house had become, by winter, unbearable in a way that required some form of occupation to counteract it, and the estate was the only occupation available to him that did not require him to examine too closely the reasons for his restlessness. He found, to his own quiet and unwelcome surprise, that the work absorbed him in a manner nothing had absorbed him in years, and that the absorption brought with it, unbidden, a clarity about his own conduct that he had successfully avoided for the better part of his adult life. He began to understand, walking the tenant boundaries in the cold spring mornings, that the burden he had named to Mary Ann in the long gallery had never truly been his family at all, but the unexamined expectation he had inherited along with the title, the expectation that a lord's household was a duty to be managed rather than a life to be lived, and that he had for 11 years mistaken the coldness this expectation required of him for a fact about his own nature, rather than a habit he had never once questioned. He did not know that spring whether the understanding had arrived in time to matter. He returned to Fenmarsh in June, this time without concealment, having written ahead to Prudence Wren, not to Mary Ann directly, judging correctly that a letter addressed to her would go unanswered, requesting permission to call, and stating plainly, in the manner he had learned, slowly and at some cost, to value over the careful indirection that had characterized most of his correspondence for most of his life, that he wished to speak with his wife and see his children, and that he understood entirely if the request was refused. Prudence had shown the letter to Marianne without comment, watching her niece's face as she read it, with the same assessing attention she brought to a bolt of cloth. Mary Ann had read it twice, in the corner of the shop where the light was best, standing very still, and had said finally, "He has learned to write a sentence without hiding inside it. That is new. Will you see him?" "I will see him," Mary Ann said, "because the children are his as much as mine, whatever else has passed between us, and because I find I am no longer afraid of what he might say to me." I think that is the part that has actually changed, Aunt Prudence, not him, me. He arrived on a Saturday in late June, on foot from the coaching inn rather than by carriage, a choice Mary Ann noted without comment and filed away, in the manner she had developed over the past year of filing small observations away for later consideration. He stood in the doorway of the shop in the late afternoon light with an uncertainty she did not remember him ever displaying in 11 years of marriage. And for a long moment neither of them spoke. The shop's ordinary sounds, the bell above, the door still faintly swinging, a customer's low conversation with Prudence at the far counter, filling the space where a greeting might otherwise have gone. "You look well," he said finally. "I am well," she said. "That is not a courtesy." "Corwin, it is simply accurate." He nodded, accepting the correction without argument, which she noted as a second small change. "I have come to say," he said, "that I was wrong. Not merely wrong in the manner of a man who regrets a difficult sentence spoken in a difficult hour, though I regret that too. Wrong in the deeper sense. Wrong about what the weight actually was, and wrong to have set it down in the way I did, upon you and the children, rather than carrying it myself and asking, at some point in 11 years, for help I never once thought to ask for." "You have had a year to arrive at this," Mary Ann said, not unkindly, but without softening it either. "I have had a year," he agreed, "and I do not ask you to consider it sufficient. I ask only that you allow me to be present in Peter's and Alice's lives in whatever manner you judge appropriate, and that you allow me, if you are willing, to demonstrate over as much time as it requires that the man who said what he said in the long gallery is not the whole of what I am capable of being." She was quiet for a long moment, looking at him with an attention that he found, standing beneath it, both uncomfortable and in some way he could not have articulated, the first honest exchange they had had in over a decade. Behind him, through the shop window, she could see the corner of the eave where the wren had nested since December, its small brown shape visible now and then against the gray stone, singing with the same disproportionate confidence it had sung, with all winter, entirely unconcerned with the conversation taking place below it. "You may see them," she said finally. "Not as their father returning to claim what he set down, Corwin. As a man who intends, over time, to earn back a place he gave away freely and without being asked to give it. Those are different things, and I will be watching to see which one you actually are." "I understand the difference," he said. "I intend to be the second." The year that followed did not resolve itself into the kind of clean reconciliation that either of them might once have imagined such a story required. Corwin came to Fenmarsh once a month at first, then more often, taking rooms at the coaching inn, rather than presuming upon Prudence's house, spending his visits in the unglamorous particulars of actual presence, walking with Peter along the river, listening to Alice's increasingly elaborate accounts of the wren's supposed opinions on matters of household importance, sitting in Prudence's small parlor in the evenings, answering Mary Ann's careful, unsentimental questions about the state of Ashdown Hall's tenant farms, with the same directness she had once wished for 11 years that he would bring to every other conversation between them. He did not ask her to return. She understood, without his needing to say so, that he had learned enough in the intervening year to know that asking would be its own kind of taking, a demand dressed as a reconciliation, and that whatever came next would need to be something she chose rather than something he requested. She found, watching him learn this, slowly, imperfectly, with the particular stiffness of a man unlearning 11 years of habit, that something in her which had gone very quiet during her marriage had begun cautiously to make itself heard again. The feather remained pressed in her ledger through that year and into the next, and in the following spring, when Corwin asked her, not the children, her directly, in a letter that contained no confession and no self-justification, but simply a plain question, asked in the manner he had spent 2 years learning to use, whether she would consider, not a return to what had been, but the building of something neither of them had yet tried to build. She took the feather from the ledger and held it for a long moment before she answered, feeling its small, familiar weight, the particular softness that had not diminished in the 2 years she had kept it. She thought of the long gallery and the window, and the sentence that had ended one life, and, she understood now, had been the unplanned beginning of another, hers, built with her own hands, in a shop that smelled of new cloth and old wood. Among figures she balanced herself, and decisions she made without asking anyone's permission to make them. She thought of what she had said to him that afternoon, and understood, turning the feather over in her fingers, that she had not been wrong to say it, and did not need to unsay it now in order to answer him differently. She wrote back 3 words, in the same neat and consistent hand she used for the shop's accounts. Come and see. He came in April and stood again in the doorway of the shop, where the wren still nested above the back door, its small, clear song filling the ordinary afternoon, and Mary Ann looked at him for a long moment with the particular clarity of a woman who has done the work of building a life that did not require him, and who understood, standing in the middle of it, that she was free to choose him now for reasons that had nothing to do with need. I carried it alone, she said, as I told you I would. I want you to understand that before anything else is decided. I know, he said. I watched you do it. I do not ask to be given what you built. I ask only to be permitted, if you are willing, to help carry what comes next. Not because you require the help, but because I have finally understood the difference between a burden shared and a burden set down on someone else's shoulders, and I would like, for whatever years remain to us, to practice the first kind rather than the second. The wren sang above the doorway, indifferent to the weight of what had been said beneath it, and the shop's ordinary afternoon light fell across the counter where Mary Ann Wren, she had begun in the 2 years since Ashdown Hall to think of herself by both names at once, the given and the built, stood considering a question that no longer had the power to determine her worth, only to shape, if she chose it, the particular company in which she carried a life she had already proven entirely on her own that she was capable of carrying.